Everyone, welcome to the Divine Feminine series. This is a series that Brian Penny and I've been working on for the past few months. Um, this is based on the book Goddess Power Awakening the Wisdom of the Divine Feminine in Your Life by Isabella Price. What I plan to do is, just so you guys know, I'll ask questions in the in between topics. You know, um, so if anybody has any questions or comments, you can feel free. You can type exclamation point in chat and or raise your hand in Zoom and I'll call on you. Just gonna start. The benefits of this experience. I love when Brian did this, with one of his presentations. And so the benefits of this experience in studying the feminine goddesses is raises awareness and acknowledges the divine feminine. It expresses appreciation and gratitude for the divine feminine, and it provides a forum where participants are encouraged to speak about the divine feminine in their lives and in others' lives. And then we're going to learn about the goddess quest as a complement to the hero's journey. And I love that because, and I didn't do that, that was Brian. Um, but I love that phrase because, it is a compliment to the hero's journey, but it's from a female perspective. Um, the reason why we started this series is because, we were interested to see, the divine feminine and the goddesses were not something that's studied, or that you hear a lot about in modern religion, or when people study religion, it seems to have a male slant. So what we wanted to do with this series, excuse me, is that we wanted to swing the pendulum a little bit. And so, to bring it like, more to center, and focus on the divine feminine in this series, just so it provides another perspective, and we can see, the female energy in that. So Penny or Brian, do you want to add anything?
Well, I guess, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I guess I would add that more and more people think it's a needed perspective that needs to be added. Some of the points I noted when you were talking, it's the divine feminine and goddess worship tends to focus on the complementary nature of opposites, as opposed to the oppositional or conflicting nature that you sometimes see in the male dominated or the male ascendant religions. And in conjunction with that, recently I've been thinking there's a wholeness. There's one thing I think that's often overlooked, because people are often talking about unity and one God and one truth and one essence, is that in life, there are a lot of things and it's not just one underlying being, there are a lot of beings, and it's the combinations of these beings that really create richness in life, and that also give rise to that different combinations give rise to the wholeness that we have in life. And so in that way, the life such as it is, in some ways, it's never final and settled. It's always evolving, but at every moment, you can take it as complete. There's a wholeness there, and each wholeness is not the only possible wholeness. There's, as evidenced by the evolution of the way things are, there are lots of different possibilities for how things can be whole. But I think the divine feminine really stresses that the necessity of the combinations, the complementary nature of the combinations to create the wholeness. And so the feminine quest, yeah, I think that's of equal importance to the hero's journey. And then also the two together, the sacred marriage, the man and the woman, or the feminine and the male. I think I think it's so obvious that you're not whole or complete if you don't have both. And you can get that with through a marriage or in other ways. But I think it's so self-evident, like the air we breathe or the gravity that holds us in place, that people overlook it. So I think it's good that we spend some time on, given that a lot of religion focuses on the male aspects, I think it's good we focus on the female.
Yeah, I agree. And I love one of the things that you talked about was wholeness. And I think that's what studying both the masculine and the feminine. And the thing I loved about this book, and the thing that we're going to see tonight, is we're going to talk about some of the male figures because there was a sacred marriage there. And it was a complementary marriage. You know, you'll see how they're different, how these goddesses and gods, different personalities went together. And I think you're right. Wholeness is a perfect thing. Penny, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I guess I would just say, when we started this study, it was kind of very enlightening for me to find out that, you know, really for thousands or tens of thousands of years, the primary deity was feminine, and that the societies were structured in a much more balanced, complementary way than they are now. And that really great things were achieved the beginning, you know, of agriculture and medicine and pottery and writing. These were all achieved in civilizations where the woman had a very significant role. And so I think it's very important to realize that, you know, this has been part of human history, and that the feminine side of the human race has a lot to offer. And I think that as we move forward, you know, we're going to achieve a lot more if we try to achieve a more balanced view again, and integrate, you know, the feminine side as well as the masculine side in the structuring our societies and what we're doing.
Oh, thank you so much. That was just so beautiful. I don't have anything to add to that, but that was really beautiful. Thank you, Penny. Ron, did you want to speak? Let me just. Can you unmute or no?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, they say that Christianity sort of introduced the feminine into the religious practice because it brought Mary into the scene as an important figure. In Judaism, you don't have a feminine side to God. God is Yahweh, he's all man, he's masculine, it's him, it's a he. And there's no, it's a very strong masculine figure, but there's no feminine aspect to sort of temper it. Christianity brings Mary into the picture as almost like relevant, as a goddess almost, to complement Jesus's kindness and simplicity. I think in many ways that Christianity was a step ahead in some ways. Islam is very backward in that sense that it does argue that God is a man, and that the feminine really doesn't have much of a role other than to be subservient to male power. But Christianity sort of introduced that idea. I think it's valid, and I think it's probably what sold the religion to people.
Thank you, Ron. I think that was very insightful, and we're going to actually go into two Marys in this presentation. So we're going to see how that is being brought in, and we're going to talk about, just so you know, Mary Magdalene and the Virgin Mary
Right.
in this presentation. So thank you. Alrighty. So when we started this series, we started by talking about the divine masculine and the divine feminine. And these are not gendered. I just want to reiterate, why can't I talk tonight? I just want to reiterate that, you know, these are not gendered. You know, there are females that can have these male qualities. It's just classified this way. So for the divine masculine, there's logic, cognition, spirit, singular focus, structure, and action. And divine feminine, to the male's logic, is intuition. To the cognition, it's emotion. To the spirit, it's, you know, the body. To the singular focused, wide focused, structure, fluidity, and with action, rest. And the thing I love about that is that you can see here, like, these energies or these, you know, traits are complementary. You know, you need both. You need both in every way, in every aspect. In some cases, the male will be dominant, and in some cases, the female will be dominant, depending on the situation and what is needed. But it doesn't create a hierarchy where male is more important than female, or female is more important than male. So hold on one second. Thank you. Give me 1 second, guys. All right, I'm gonna have to stop the presentation. Sorry about that. Thanks, Joe. All right, sorry about that. Just gonna go right back in.
May I say one thing there, Ebony?
Yeah, absolutely.
In the last month, I've read another book about goddesses by Joseph Campbell, who really is a well-known mythologist, brings so many different perspectives to the study, religious, historical, literary, psychological, anthropological, archaeological. He's really spent his whole career on this. And he wrote a book, well, actually, it's a compilation by his foundation on the goddesses. I got that book, and he made an interesting point in that book that I had never really thought about, but I think it's valid, that you hear a lot about the shift from the hunter-gatherer society that was more female, that had more, it was more, the feminine was more ascendant in the hunter-gatherer societies, at least as regards divinity, the understanding of divinity. Then when you switched into the farming and domestication of animals, the herding of animals, it tended to shift into the masculine. That's also tied in with the advent of the Iron Age and the increase of conflicts among city-states and the growth of empire. But I'm just pointing out, those are the big, that's seen as a big dichotomy, the hunter-gatherer, and then this growth of the farming and domestication There's another distinction that Joseph Campbell drew, and that is with the increased urbanization. And it ties into what Evanique was just talking about. In the hunter-gatherer, the divine tended to be personified, imagined as a person who was feminine. That shifted over to a personification of divinity that was masculine in with the farming and domestication, and that carried over into the first empires and the city-states. With the continuation of urbanization, Joseph Campbell argues that there's been a shift towards the rise of the psychological understanding of the divine, where you can have divine aspects and feminine aspects, not divine personifications. So, and divine characteristics as opposed to divine figures. And that ties in, I think, very much with what Evanique said. And that, to me, that makes a lot of sense.
Thank you, Brian. I agree. It does make a lot of sense, and especially when we were talking about with the hunter and gatherer. You'll notice throughout this series that there is a lot of feminine goddesses that are associated with farming and fertility, not just child birth, but crops and things of that nature. And a lot of people in these cultures actually depended on these goddesses to give them a good crop. They prayed to them and they made sacrifices to them. So it's very interesting that you bring that up. Penny, did you want to say something, or?
Oh, I was just trying to read the messages.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
The only thing I would say is that some of this too, I think, is like the divine masculine and the divine feminine. It's kind of a dualistic view of the world. Like it's one thing or the other, instead of saying, there's kind of like logic or intuition. There's even when you're thinking, you're also using your intuition to combine things. And so, that some of these traits could be considered more like on a continuum, instead of saying, okay, the masculine is logic and the feminine is intuition. It's probably more realistic to really think of them as a continuum.
Yeah, I agree with that. Does anybody else have any questions or comments before I move on to the next part of the presentation? If so, you can type exclamation point in the chat, or you can raise your hand in Zoom. Allison, oh wait, let me unmute. Okay, Allison, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking about like this whole idea of history and why so much of this history isn't taught. But history is really like, it's a series of choices about what you're going to tell people about it. And I think sometimes like there's a lot of political reasons why certain history is kind of like put to the wayside and not. And sometimes what's really hard is that even when you're trying to tell a true history, you really aren't always allowed to, if you're teaching history. So, like there's always a saying that history is taught by the winners, and that the losers get anthropology. It's like a joke in the history world, and it's really accurate. But it's kind of interesting when you're looking at even at like the history of religion. I mean, I feel like just in general, in America and Europe, we're mostly taught American and European history. So we mostly learn about American and European religion. But even when we're talking about American history, we're starting with Columbus. We're ignoring the entire history before that, which was very matriarchal with goddesses. So I just think it's, great that you've done this. I haven't always been able to attend, but I've watched most of the videos and, I think it's just an important thing to really learn about all of this. And it's kind of like you're just reclaiming history in a way, because you're learning about what actually, these different cultures, this is what they really believed. And to only learn it through one little lens of this masculine gods is really leaving out the whole, a very large part of the story. So that was one thing that I thought. And then also with this chart, I think it's kind of interesting how, the feminine side, we tend to have this idea that women are sort of on the feminine side and men are on the masculine side. But I think if any of us think about individuals that we all know men who are extremely emotional, and we all know women who are very, very structured and logical, so I think most people are really a combination of all of these things. They might sort of lean more to one or the other, but, it's kind of interesting. But anyway, those are some thoughts.
Thank you. And, I was about to say, Brian actually did 2 great presentations. If I get a chance, I'll put them in the chat. But it was, Brian did a very good research on how the feminine was, I wouldn't want to say written out, but why did it decrease? And they're great presentations, and he did a lot of work on that. And I don't know if you saw them or not, like you might have, but just in case you didn't, really check them out, because they go through the history. And another point about history is Gary last night actually did a great presentation on, it was on the Gospel of John, but the first part he talks about history as literature, and how history tells a story, and and how they use different genres: comedy, tragedy. I can't remember the other ones satirical, and I can't remember the other one off the top of my head, but that was also really good. And that first part just shows, how history is told, and the genre in which it's told. So it's just a very interesting thing. When you were saying history, I just thought about that. So just a couple of things.
I'll check them both out. Thanks.
You're welcome.
If I may say that, just, I talked about the shift between hunter-gatherer and the farming, and then finally the Joseph Campbell's distinction on urbanization. I think a real tipping point was that early Iron Age, and that's around 1000 BC. But the date varies dramatically from place to place. But I looked at the city-states of Athens and Jerusalem at that point in time, and both of those, as the Iron Age came into, as iron asserted itself over copper and bronze, weapons and tools became much more much heavier and more effective. And and both in agriculture and in war, the masculine became more ascendant, and with that came the growth of or the ascendance of the male gods over the female gods. And the simplest example I can give is, and these are both in city states. So one is Jerusalem and the other one is in Sumeria, in the city of Uruk, and other city states there. But it varies again in each city state. But in the Sumerian city states, they would tend to talk about the goddess and her consort, who was Tammuz or Dumuzi, depending on whether you use Sumerian or Akkadian. And and there have been a couple archaeological finds around Jerusalem, south of Jerusalem, that referred to Yahweh and his consort. So they're both talking about city-states, but there's a shift. The older city-state in Sumeria, or very early agriculture, the female goddess was still predominant, and there was a male consort. Then you go over to Jerusalem or Judea, the city state there, very early period. There's some evidence that Yahweh had a consort. Asherah was her name. And but the male is dominant in that relationship in Judea. And they came at a later age, more of the early Iron Age. So I think that's a great example of how there is I would say there is a shift around the beginning of the Iron Age, but it's very gradual.
Thank you for that, Brian. I really appreciate like all that you bring to this. So if there are no more questions or comments, I'm gonna move on. So the first goddess we're going to revisit is Goddess, and Isis is the goddess of 1,000 names in the book. So Isis in Egyptian cosmology, according to the matrix of creation, she's the great goddess. She turns the earth in her orb. She gives light to the sun, and the stars are responsive to her. So this started, the Isis religion started in Heliopolis. It's the religious center dedicated to the sun god Ra. The world emerged into light from the dark primordial waters when the god Atum, dual creator, male and female, generated the male Shu, which is, dominant in air, space, and light, and the female Tefnut, moisture and order, which is kind of ironic because that's kind of a male attribute. So Shu and Tefnut brought forth the god Geb, the earth, and the goddess Nut, the sky. I just love how that kind of relates to the creation story in the Bible, but in the Bible, it's just one God. And there's, he creates the earth and he names it earth, and then he creates the sky, he creates the land above or the mass above and that sky. So I just love that like similarity. Nut and gave birth to Isis and Osiris, and Seth and Nephthys. So Isis is known as the great goddess. Like I said before, she turns the earth into her orb, and she gives light to the sun, and stars are responsive. So actually, this is kind of a repeat slide. I apologize. I thought I got rid of all of those. So Isis is known as the great mother and facilitator of civilization. Isis was knowledgeable about the natural processes of generation and regeneration. Egypt was able to create a surplus because of this knowledge and able to obtain wealth. And so with this, I just think of, like Brian was talking about farming, and, when you learn how the seed works and, how it regenerates, and you can make so much comes up from that. And, just the ability of what building a surplus could do. You could think about other things, you could think about self-actualization because you just weren't worried about just surviving. Isis assisted pregnant women in delivery. She trained Egyptians in crafts such as weaving, pottery, corn grinding, and bread baking. And Isis was concerned with family and, sorry, I can't see that, sorry. And I can't see that word. Right. As a marriage, family and marriage as an institution. So she's kind of the one that kind of worked, I wouldn't say created, but thought of this as very important. And I also think of here when she says Isis trained Egyptians in crafts as weaving and pottery, corn grinding and bread baking, think about, people exchanging those things. And we can see the beginning of some type of commerce with Isis, right? somebody sees something they wanted, they exchange it for something else. So, just thought about that. So does anybody I see Ron's hand is up, but so Ron, do you want to say anything before I go into the mysteries of Isis and Osiris? Are you able to unmute, Ron? Hold on. Okay, I didn't put that back on. Give me 1 second.
Can you hear me
Okay.
now?
Yes.
Well, the Jews were so adamant about having one God. There's only one God. His name is Yahweh. You can't have two gods. You can't have three gods. You have to have one God, because they lock themselves up into this one idea of having one God, and that God has to be a male. They sort of shunned any possibility for the feminine to enter the picture and as part of a divinity. Christianity brings it back in the form of Mary. But for the Jews, there's nothing equivalent to Mary as an object of worship. So the Jews did this deliberately. They did this because they wanted to create a nation under one God, indivisible, under one God. And that was the problem, that all these, if you look at the Greeks and the Romans, they were polytheistic. And the polytheism actually led to a lot of warfare, tribalism, conflicts between villages and village over which God they believed in. And the Trojans and the Greeks were at war. They believed in the same gods, but there were many gods. So if there are many gods, then you can kind of break it up and choose whichever god you want to be your patron. But the Jews were trying to modify all that by having one. They locked themselves up into one god, and that was a problem for them, because with this one god, it meant that everyone had to believe in the same deity. And then Christianity sort of opens it up to bringing Mary into the picture, and saints, all other people were sort of managed to become divine. But a lot of it is political. The decision to have one God was a political one, because they wanted to have all the Jews under one banner, because they saw the problem in having multiple gods. Like what happened to the Greeks. They broke up into different city-states. Each city-state had its own god and their own worship practice, and that was not good for politics. The best political way to handle this is to have one single God. So a lot of it is political. It's not even religious.
Thank you for that perspective. Yeah, I definitely agree that a lot of it is political. And like I said, I think Brian really did a good job of covering the political aspects on, on how the goddess disappeared, in a sense. So, and Brian also did covered the Jewish culture. So it's really, really great. And when I get a chance, I'm going to put it in the chat so you guys can go look at it. But if I don't, or if I forget, you can always go to 52 Living Ideas on YouTube, and you can go to the Divine Feminine series and you'll see it there. So now we're going to go over the mysteries of Isis and Osiris.
May I add one thing?
Oh, I'm sorry, Brian, go ahead.
Just to follow up on what Ron said, I definitely agree with the shift with Mary. I would add to that, and this was really highlighted for me in a couple ways recently, that Jesus also is embodying feminine characteristics.
Mhm.
If you read John, for example, he engages in many practices there of service and humility that are and sacrifice, self-sacrifice, which are which are seen as and are presented and understood as more feminine characteristics. So people are writing on that now, and that ties into the psychological, the evolving psychological understanding of instead of the personifications, you have the aspects of an individual which can be seen as masculine or feminine. So the only thing I would add, I guess, or suggest to add to what Ron said is that in addition to Mary, you have the example of Jesus, which also embodies feminine characteristics in a way that some of the gods did not or could not.
Yes.
Yeah, I totally agree. I would totally agree with that. And um, I think one thing that Jesus does is, even though he is the son and came to earth as a man, one of the things I think I asked in high school, and I was like, well, why did he have to come as a man? And so uh, when I went to Catholic high school, one of the brothers that taught, he said, because Jewish culture was a male dominated culture, like they would have totally disregarded a female at that time. But what Jesus did in his ministry is that he emphasized women, like, he had women in his practice and he held them as equal to him, and he respected them for their knowledge and, their dedication to him. And, he really, even though he was male and he was in a male dominated culture, he showed how to treat females in a way that respected their intelligence. And I just love that when he said that. So, and I think that goes right along with what you said about, Jesus having female characteristics. Um, so thank you for that. Nari, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what you just said about Jesus. I read somewhere, and I'm sorry, I should have written it down. But when Jesus was having conversation with his disciples, and Mary Magdalene came in, one of them said, she shouldn't be here. She's a woman and she's lesser or something than we are. And then he said to them, I will make her a man, and make her one of us. So it went into depth about how he was trying to appease his disciples to have her included and influence them in that way. So I thought that was very interesting. I need to find it to quote exactly where that was written, but I don't know if anybody else has read that. Anyway, just wanted to add that.
Thank you. Thank you, Nari. So now we're going to go into the mysteries of Isis and Osiris. So Isis ruled Egypt with her brother/husband Osiris. Osiris was the oldest son of Gebinut, and so that gave him the right to rule Egypt. As you'll see in different slides, actually I'll just move. His brother Set was very upset about that. Like he wanted to rule Egypt, but the firstborn son gets to do that. So Osiris is known as the giver of seeds, which will be very important in the story, when you'll see his kind of quote unquote rebirth. But Osiris was believed to have taught the Egyptians how to raise crops, build cities, irrigation canals, and devise a legal system, which, being in the legal field, I just thought that was really interesting. That he did teach people the legal system, which I was like, oh, that's interesting. That's something I want to explore a little more. So we're going to go now to Seth and Osiris. So like I said, Osiris was the firstborn, so he got to rule Egypt, but Seth was jealous of Osiris's power and and success. And Seth was also in love with Isis, which is also Isis and Osiris's brother, coincidentally. Seth wanted to rule Egypt and marry Isis. So he came up with a plan to do this, which we're going to see. But, Seth was commonly affiliated with chaotic forces, destruction, death, drought, and the desert. And you know, it looks bad and it sounds bad, but as we studied in other religions, you know, death, destruction, um, the drought in the desert are all necessary. Just wanted to go over that really quick. Like, you know, it seemed like they're not good things, but it's part of the cycle of life, right? You know, a seed dies so that a plant is born. You know, you see chaotic forces. Sometimes it takes chaos to bring out creativity. Um, it's destruction. You know, sometimes things have to be destroyed in order for new things to come about. Sometimes if you think of it ideologically, sometimes old ideas have to go away in order for new ideas to come in. If we talk about the drought in the desert, we can see in different religions, the drought in the desert is not fun to go through, but it is also essential in growth, both personal growth and spiritual growth. We saw that with Jesus in the desert, just as a quick sum. But you know, as we can see, sometimes these things can be destructive unnecessarily. So as we can see, when these things go awry and they turn into emotions of like jealousy and envy, we can see what happens here. And that's the story of Seth and Osiris. And I always say that, you know, what is the storyteller trying to tell us in this? So with these, you know, different myths or stories, they're trying to tell us something. So so with Seth and Osiris, the story of that is that Seth tricks Osiris into a coffin and casts it off into the sea. Just the background story on that. They were at a dinner party and, you know, they're talking and Seth is like, oh, you know, Seth plots before and he creates this coffin that is the exact size for Osiris. And so he tells Osiris, this is the exact size for you. And Osiris gets in. And I always think like, why? Like, why would you get into a coffin? But oh well, he trusted his brother, and he tricks Osiris. He locks the coffin and casts it off into the sea, and the coffin lands in Byblos. Um, because if you notice earlier, we talked about Osiris being the giver of seeds, and you know, associated with fertility and growth. A tree grows around the coffin. Um, in Byblos, though, you know, people were getting wood from this tree, you know, and getting other things from this tree because it was very fertile. Why? Because Osiris was locked in there. Um, but Isis retrieves Osiris from the tree. Unfortunately, Seth finds that out and dismembers Osiris. And then Isis has to put Osiris back together, and together they conceive a child. Now, I just want to note there are a couple different variations to this story. One variation, of course, is that she gets every part of him back together, but the member she needs to produce a child, which is thrown into the sea, and the fish start producing abundantly until she retrieves it. So just a couple of those things. Oh, sorry, going back. So, you know, oh, let me just go to the previous slide. Sorry. So basically what happens is, you know, after she conceives a child, there's the child, Horus. I'm not going to go too much into it, but Horus and Seth are set against each other, and you know, there's always just conflict because of what happened with Osiris and in the Egyptian culture. Isabella Price doesn't go too much into that story. That's why I'm not going to go into it too much here, but just to give you kind of like a preview, because that might be something we may want to go into further. So I see Janice has her hand up. If anybody else wants to speak, you can either type exclamation point in chat or raise your hand in Zoom.
Hi.
Janice.
Hi there. I just wanted to know this one part at the bottom here, the ice puts Osiris back together. Would you say, and they still conceive a child because they didn't have that particular member of his body? Would you say that this is somewhat reflective of an immaculate conception?
No, because she actually does find the member, and that's how she conceives.
Okay, because I didn't read that part at all. And I just want to know, when you use the word coffin, that this information that you gleaned actually use the word coffin as opposed to sarcophagus?
I don't have an answer to that. That's what Isabella Price uses in the book. Sorry, I wish I could have a better answer than that.
Okay, well, it's just interesting a choice of words, right? Because it wouldn't make sense to use coffin in this particular time period unless it's before the sarcophagus came about. So I was just kind of wondering where the timeline was on this. That's all. Thank you.
Yeah, and just one thing, I think probably Isabella Price, and I can't speak for the author, but my guess is that she probably used that language just because it was just easier for people to understand in the English world. That's just my guess. Brian or Penny, do you have anything before I move on to the next goddess?
Yeah, I have a couple of things here. The number one, I think, or maybe three, that this is Isis really went through a lot to retrieve Osiris, and I'd had obvious, benefits, a very significant act for the Egyptian culture. So this, I think, was the way she retrieved him and revived him is an example of the feminine quest. Also, which I think people tend to overlook, they always are thinking of the hero's journey, but this is a great example of a feminine quest. The other thing is, I think it's a great example of a sacred marriage, which I think kind of, in my opinion, it distinguishes the goddess religions from the more God-oriented. God-oriented religions don't emphasize the possibility of a sacred marriage. At least the ones in the West, whereas the goddess traditions in the West did embrace more of a complementary approach. You never saw a goddess religion without gods as well, even if the goddesses were ascendant. Another thing, I guess, would be that the Iris's quest here, I think, is typical of the type of role that goddesses, the divine feminine, plays. And I think you can see this in society as well. Even today, it's a transgenerational role where she's retrieving the past, but then creating the future through reviving her husband and then giving birth to the son, who will be the new king. And this is a theme that's repeated often in these goddess traditions, and I think it really captures something that goes on in real life all the time. So those are just a couple observations I had. Oh, I guess maybe one more that ties into the wholeness and complementary comments I made at the beginning. It's interesting to note Osiris is the giver of seeds. The male is the giver of seeds in Egypt. In Sumerian tradition, Inanna, the goddess, is the giver of seeds. So you can see that, just as Penny's pointed out, and Evanique's also flagged, you have traits or characteristics which tend to be seen as masculine or feminine. They're not necessarily that, but I think the important thing is that there's a complementary nature of the parts that comes together to create an integral whole. That's all I've got.
And I thought, if you don't mind, I would read something. This is from When God Was a Woman. But when you were talking about how we're going to see the similarities in like the different goddesses, this was a book that was written in the 2nd century AD by the Roman writer Apuleius. and it was translated by Robert Graves. It was called The Golden Ass. And in it, the goddess herself appears. And this is what she says: I am nature, the universal mother, mistress of all elements, primordial child of time, sovereign of all things spiritual, queen of the dead, queen also of the immortals, the single manifestation of all gods and goddesses that are. My nod governs the shining heights of heaven, the wholesome sea breezes, the lamentable silences of the world below. Though I am worshipped in many aspects, known by countless names, and propitiated with all manner of different rites, yet the whole round earth venerates me. The primeval Phrygians called me Pessinousia, mother of the gods. The Athenians, sprung from their own soil, called me Cypronian Artemis. For the islanders of Cyprus, I am Pythian Aphrodite. For the archers of Crete, I am Tecna. For the trilingual Sicilians, Stygian Proserpine. And for the Aleutians, their ancient mother of the corn. Some know me as Juno, some as Bellona of the battles, others as Hecate, others again as Ramubia. But both races of Ethiopians, whose lands the morning sun first shines upon, and the Egyptians who excel in ancient learning and worship me with proper ceremonies proper to my godhead, called me by my true name, namely Queen Isis.
Wow. That last line really just brought it home. Thank you for that. Does anybody else have anything they want to share? I'll give it another 30 seconds. Ron, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think in those days they saw the feminine as disempowering. I think the feminine gave men a certain kind of power, a certain understanding of the world that they didn't have as men. Carl Jung has a whole psychology based around this. I don't know if you discussed it in this group, but he has the anima and the animus, that every man has a feminine side and every woman has a masculine side. And that's biologically true because we all come from men and women. But men repress their feminine side because it's seen socially as sort of like weak. You're not supposed to be a sissy. You're not supposed to be sensitive. You're not supposed to be like loving and caring and intuitive. Men practice rationality. They practice self-control, all in an effort to become more manly according to social needs. And women practice domestic arts and child rearing and sensitivity and love and care, because that's seen as feminine. There's so many interesting movies that are made around this. Anybody see the movie with Goldie Hawn, Sergeant Benjamin? Where she plays like this Jewish princess and she doesn't know, she's got long fingernails and she doesn't know where anything is because everybody takes care of her. And then she's inadvertently conscripts into the army and she can't get out of it, and they sort of make a man out of her. It's very funny because she becomes tough. She becomes actually more feminine as a man than she was as a woman.
Is that Private Benjamin?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Remember that?
Yes.
She actually learns how to become very strong, and the strength actually enhances her feminine aspect. Because before she was very feminine, but very weak, very sort of childlike, very sort of lost, and always the long fingernails and the perfumes and the long hair. And all the details of femininity were there, but not the soul of the feminine. But Carl Jung makes a whole psychology out of it. He calls it the anima. The feminine of the man is the anima. The anima is feminine for spirit, and the animus is masculine. Women repress their animus, and men repress their anima. And to become a whole person, you have to really become bisexual in a sense. You really
You have to integrate the masculine and the feminine within
Exactly.
yourself. And that's what I kind of wrote back there on the chat, but no one saw it, I guess.
Yeah, that's the key word: integration of the masculine and feminine. It makes you healthier. You men think it's you're being a sissy. If you love poetry, if you love to paint, you're a sissy because that's girl stuff. And girls think that, competing and playing ball and being rough is too masculine. So the culture sort of dictates to us where we should be in terms of these genders. I think
It's interesting you say that about the poets, because most of the poets back in, I guess, I don't know, a couple hundred years ago were written by men, and quite a lot of the romantic novels have been written by men. So it's that was their, and that's why the musicians are really great, because that's how they get in touch with their feminine side, by being able to create these things, because they couldn't normally do it face to face, man to man. So they do it in this way, right?
Exactly.
Thank you, both. Up next, I have Allison.
I think I love that you mentioned that Saving Private Benjamin, because there's this one scene where she has to go to boot camp and it's raining and she's in this mud and she just starts crying and she goes, "I just want to go out to lunch." I have been quoting that for years because there's so many situations where I feel like when I was growing up, I was just supposed to have this easy little go out to lunch sort of life as a woman. And, life kind of taught me that I had to take on masculine things because I had to survive. And I just always would say that line. It was just great. But the one thing that I want to say though, about a lot of these, sort of rigid roles is that they're really changing. I was talking to some women at work today who are in, they're like about late 20s, maybe early 30s. And I was talking to them about their marriages and they were, they have completely different marriages than people did who are 20, 30 years older. They're completely different where, they work and the husbands do things at home. And it's, they were sort of shocked to hear what, marriage is like for older generations. And because they're like, well, why would you do that? Like, it was like shocking. They couldn't even imagine such a world. So sometimes this world that you're describing as being very rigid, that may be true for an older generation, but that is not true for, this generation that's coming up at all. It's very, very different for them. So I think, and I think what's kind of interesting is in the 80s, you had all of these like musicians like David Bowie who were kind of playing with these roles of both masculine and feminine. And that was kind of like the beginning of people starting to accept that they could have both sides within them. And now you see it where, it's much more prevalent to have people doing, everything. So, it is changing. It's not all the same. Yeah.
Thank you, Allison. Does anybody else have anything to add? All right, so now we're going to talk about the next goddess we're going to revisit. And correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, but I think this is one of your favorite ones. Is Inanna / Ishtar Ashera. So who is she? She's a Sumerian, Akkadian, Canaanite, Israeli goddess, right? That's a lot. So as you can see, she varies across different traditions. And this is primarily about the sacred marriage and descent into the underworld. I like this one too, but probably for different reasons than Brian, which is actually the underworld part that we're going to get to. So, Inanna's many realms and powers. So, celestial, and Anna is considered to be the queen of heaven, the moon, the morning, and the evening star, Venus, and the star Sirius are among her symbols. Just as a note, you're going to see later on in this presentation, Mary, the mother of God, is also designated as the queen of heaven by the Catholic Church. And I can't remember the year off the top of my head, but it is in that presentation. So, and it's very similar artwork and statues that have Inanna with the stars around her head and the Queen of Heaven, and Mary has that same imagery. So, as you can see, it just goes across cultures. In terms of nature, Inanna is considered to be the queen of the earth, nature, as well as heaven. As such, she was a goddess of fertility, love, and the seasons, agriculture for the Sumerian people. In terms of civilization, as queen of practical knowledge, she accumulates many spiritual realms on earth: political, familial, military, agricultural, and arts and crafts. Similarly, like Isis, and as we will see later on, Oshun. And as also with Isis and Oshun, Inanna was not considered to have exclusive powers in the realms of heaven, earth, and civilization. She shared her realms with gods such as Dumuzi, her son, lover, and husband, and her powers are complementary to the gods' powers. As we can see that balance between masculine and feminine, and obviously we see that sacred marriage come in. And it is important to note that she had many realms and was always seen to add new ones. Brian, do you want to add anything?
No, I thought that was great. Thank you.
Okay. So one important role that she has, the sacred marriage that we just mentioned, and annual assurance of a good harvest. So the sacred marriage involved a ritual sexual intercourse between Inanna's high priestesses and the city's state king or high priest, representing the god Dumuzi. Tammuz is another name for him. The intercourse was part of the New Year festival observed each fall to ensure the cyclical renewal of nature and abundant harvest for the people of ancient Mesopotamia. It was agricultural prosperity, not a human child, which was the anticipated outcome of this sacred union. So going more into the sacred marriage and the political succession of kings. Inanna is essential for the transfer of power from one king to the next. She provides intergenerational continuity and political and in the royal family life. The god Dumuzi, Inanna's husband, was believed to provide the fertilizing powers for the earth, Inanna, which ensured abundant harvest. Dumuzi bestowed the power of erstwhile king or high priest. The king was responsible for ensuring the harvest by impregnating the high priestess of the Hierogamos. This was if there was a poor harvest, it was time for the selection of a new king. The new king or priest was considered to be the son lover of Inanna. The king or high priest became Inanna's son by selection process, which is differed over the centuries and by circumstance. The king's status as a lover husband was consecrated at the Hierogamos. Conversely, the king will select a new high priestess as needed. Both selection process were necessary for the continuity in life. So this is where we're going to talk about Inanna. So before I move on, Brian, do you want to add anything?
Well, I guess I would just stress two things. Number one, since reading this comment from Joseph Campbell about and I think he's probably right, that with increased urbanization, we tend to conceive of religious issues more and more in psychological terms. So the feminine aspects, the male aspects. I'm having a hard time, and I've tried, but having a hard time getting my mind around the mentality that might have existed in ancient Sumeria, where the high priest and priestess would get together and have sex, at the time of planting seeds. It's not it's not psychological. It's a reenactment of what really happens in nature. But how did they ever hit upon this idea, except that maybe the similarities between human conception and the the planting of seeds and the growing of crops. And that, as I've said earlier, the personification of all of these events, these energies in life. The growing crops, the seeds transform, the crops grow. All of this, I think, was understood was personified in order to try to understand it. So anyway, the one thing I'd say is there's a very different mentality, I think, back then. The other thing is since I first presented on this, Inanna, I've kind of teased out the difference, the chronology between the evolution of basically the evolution of kings. And I think priests clearly came before kings. Kings were an outgrowth of chieftains. And chieftains were they're like referred to as judges in the Old Testament. They were not always, but they tended to be more temporary positions. That was certainly true in Sumeria, where if there was a national emergency, then you would, let's say, typically the way I've read about it is that if invaders were coming, this would be a national emergency, and someone would appoint a chieftain, who would be a male, to organize the defense of the city. And as conflict became more and more continuous, and with the Iron Age it became more lethal, the chieftains evolved into kings, and in the top of the hierarchy replaced the priests. But I think before the kings established themselves at the top, you had the priests at the top, with chieftains appointed on just a temporary basis. And that makes sense, and there seems to be a fair amount of consensus about that. So when you talk about, we're talking about centuries of evolution here. At the beginning, the hieros gamos was the high priest and the priestess reenacting the planting of seeds through a sexual act at the beginning of the planting season. But then later it was replaced by the king. I just wanted to add that. I think that's kind of I think it is in some circumstances an important note to add. And then I would add also, I would stress, I have mentioned that I think that the feminine is characterized as preserving continuity between generations. They're discovering, archaeological sites are being discovered in southern Turkey now, where there are a lot of vultures that are pictured in the to the extent they had figures. So these are very early figures, but quite clearly they're vultures, and they seem to be consuming human remains. That's maybe the way they dealt with burial back then. They still do that today in Tibet, for example. Bodies are fed to the birds, and by the shamans. The shamans are in charge of that. But back then, it seemed that the vulture was considered a feminine spirit. Goddesses were depicted as birds, and they tended to look like vultures. So again, you have this role where the women are in charge of the transgenerational changes. That's also, you see that in Osiris or in Isis, with taking care of the dead husband and resurrecting. But also the tradition of Isis is that she was the goddess of the women who lamented the deaths, kind of the official mourners at Egyptian funerals. So again, there's some continuity there where the women have, tended to play that role. I take on board, and I really agree with and embrace what Allison said. I think it's good that we're getting more flexible. But even today, if you look in church basements, you know, who's cooking up the meals if at the funerals? It tends to be the women. So that's still going on today. This them stepping in and playing an important role. I think the problem is, I don't know if it's a problem, but let's say the thing I think is missing, yes, it is a very significant role, but it's not given the proper recognition in today's society as being very important. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, Brian. Just to, a couple of the thoughts I had about what you said, especially about that sacred marriage and the act. I do think I agree with you when you say it is, I think it's a symbolic of all creation, right? And cycles, the planting of the seeds and, the growth and, talking about, what I was talking about when I was talking about set, like that period of darkness. And then, the plant comes up and then there's a harvest and then the cycle goes on. In certain, in witchcraft or Wiccan is what they call it today. In Wiccan religions, they celebrate all of those cycles, like the harvest or the darkness, which is what we're in now. Technically, in the winter season, we're in the darkness, and that's the period where we're resting and we're preparing for the seed to be planted, and then moving through those cycles of the harvest. Well, the planting I think is the spring, and then the spring, the planting, the harvest is in the spring and the summer and the fall. And I'm probably messing that up, but the point is that it's cyclical. So thank you. If anybody else doesn't have anything, I'll give it another 30 seconds.
I guess I'll mention quickly, if I may,
Yeah,
There's-
absolutely.
I've read another book about this, the early Iron Age recently. I think it makes a very good point. It's called The Walls. And these early cities defended themselves by building up walls. The early, some are stone, but depending if the stones are available, but a lot of them were just made out of mud brick. And they were constantly falling down, as well as the houses in those towns. So there's a new industry that grew up, not just all these crafts, a lot of which that grew out of domestic arts, but construction and constant renovation and rebuilding and enlarging these walls as war became more continuous and more lethal. And so who worked in the construction industry? It was the men that were carrying all this mud around. And a lot of the symbols and the figurines of the kings were symbols of them carrying mud on their heads using baskets. So it just, this role of kingship became more important as you have the defense is more of a continuous operation. It tended to be conducted by men. So you have again, the ascendance of men on both on the defensive side and the offensive side, because the people were coming into Mesopotamia and the Levant and the rest, the Fertile Crescent. They were coming in from the desert. The nomads basically were coming in from the desert or from the mountains, and it was the men who were attacking in chariots or on foot with these iron weapons, and the men were defending inside, but first of all, having constructed the walls. So the construction industry is also something that helped to give rise to the ascendance of men and kingship.
Thank you, Brian. So now we're going to move on to the next part. So we're going to talk about death and Anna's death and revival. So as we noted earlier, she is the queen of heaven and earth. And at one point, she decided that she wanted to rule the underworld as well. So the underworld is in the realm of the dead, ruled by her sister goddess Escargal. So the story goes is that, you know, since she wants to rule this kingdom, at each of the 7 gates of the underworld, and Anna is allowed to pass through only after being divested of one of her divine powers or worldly prerogatives. And Anna enters the throne room of Escargal, who kills her with the Eye of Death. And Nana then hangs like a rotting corpse on a hook for 3 days. During these 3 days, Inanna gains essential insights into the full circle of existence. And some of the stories, this is the story from Isabella Price, and some of the stories, they say she has to remove an article of clothing until she appears with Escargal completely naked, which makes her completely vulnerable. So just different stories. So when Inanna doesn't return, Enki, the god of wisdom, realizes that civilization in Sumeria would regress to a primitive stage if Inanna is not rescued from the realm of the dead. After all, it was she who brought the gift of civilization to Mesopotamia. So Enki devises a plan which returns Inanna from the underworld to the realm of heaven and earth. In the process, Dumuzi, Inanna's husband, is sent to the underworld to be Inanna's surrogate. But his absence during the entire year eliminates agricultural, planting. So to restore agriculture, Inanna's sister agrees to take Dumuzi's place in the underworld during one half of the year, ending each year's planting season in the fall. And this way, Dumuzi and Inanna can continue to consummate the annual hergamos each fall, ensuring the propagation of plants and a good harvest. And again, you see this as, Inanna discovers that life is cyclical. But as you can see, this is kind of like, creation, growth, death and destruction, and then new life again. So I kind of like this, the cyclical aspect of this. And so any other questions or comments before we move on to Oshun? Okay, Ron, go ahead. Ron, are you having problems unmuting?
I think human beings need some kind of narrative to explain why they're here, what their function is in life, and these stories. And they are stories. They're not necessarily true, but they're stories that are true about the fact that they're stories. And these stories are needed by human beings to sort of navigate their way through life, because life is full of a lot of hardship, a lot of misery, a lot of pain. I mean, we suffer, we die, we fall ill, we lose loved ones. We need something to explain why this is happening to us. It's totally absurd. It's the mind cannot comprehend the absurdity of it. It needs some kind of logical structure. And I think all these deities sort of function as that, whatever the deity is, it's an explanation of some kind of why these things are happening to me. Why am I losing my children? Why did my wife suddenly fall ill and die? Why am I sick? Why am I dying? I mean, these are all horrible existential situations. And I think human beings just need some kind of answer, because there's so many answers to this, so many different divinities, so many different stories. It's a story. We need a story to explain it to ourselves, so we don't go crazy.
I would agree with that. And I think one of the things that, understanding the role of myth in these, because, these are all could be considered myths, but like you said, myths are meant to tell a story, and they're there to teach us something. So if you look at these stories, it's saying, and say to yourself, what is it meant to teach me? Or what can I glean from it based on my experience? And I think each person here, and each person that hears these stories hears it from their own lens, their own perspectives, their own experiences. And I think it's meant to do that. I think any good story is meant to do that. So I would totally agree with you. Up next, I have Joe.
Yeah, it's not only to make sense of the unknown, but it's also to create an ideal as well. So that's also an important part here, and that's why having the divine feminine is so important, because the feminine actually balances out masculine. So I think that from that perspective, I think it's much more. It's than just providing an explanation as to why something happens, or some of the more painful events that people embrace. But it's also about how to live a good life. I mean, so it attempts to do that through a variety of ways, dealing with desires, bringing order to chaos, and I think that both the masculine and feminine play roles within that specifically as well. Rebirth, as far as the feminine brings, the divine feminine brings to mythos culture as well. Anyway, so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Joe. Up next, I have Paul.
Yeah, hi. Just to add to those comments, those great comments, we often in this set of meetings bring forward the idea that some of these great texts are really about inner battles. So we should add that to this description of why we need them. The divine feminine, someone mentioned Jung, and that it's a force within each of us. So you could interpret all of these as metaphors for internal struggles and internal parts of consciousness. So just another angle on their function. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. Brian or Penny, do you have anything before I move on to Oshun?
No,
Nope.
All right. So now we're going to talk about Oshun, and the name means spring or source. So this is just, like I said, this is just like quick summaries of presentations, but I wanted to talk about the Ashe first. So Odulamere which is kind of like the god, is believed to be present in the world as a vital force called Ashe by the Yoruba. Oshun, really quickly, is a part of the Yoruban culture. This ever unfolding life force, which is cyclical in nature, infuses the phenomenon and is considered a driving principle of the evolutionary process. Ashe may also be compared to the divine energetic current that flows through many conductors, such as human vessels of greater or lesser receptivity. To grow in Ashe means to respect the elders, to seek guidance, and to properly honor the Orisha, which are considered to be the personifications of Ashe as expressed through the forces of nature. So the Orisha, the Ashe finds the expression of the pantheon of deities or spirits or spiritual beings that are referred to as Orisha. These spirit beings are commonly perceived as different aspects of a singular concept of divinity. The Yoruba believe that the Orisha would wither and die without the Ashe of sacrifices. So for the Orisha, although the Orisha are not immortal, this fact clearly reveals that both humans and Orisha experience limitations and boundaries. In order to be effective, the Orisha have to be nourished. Each Orisha possesses specific character traits and is identified with a particular natural phenomena. So the Orisha are manifestations of the whole of creation. They each offer a different path to wisdom, health, and success. The Yoruba consult with the priest or priestesses of a particular Orisha in times of difficulty and ask for guidance. For spiritual aspirants, personal growth is marked by progressive stages of initiation, culminating in that of Orisha priesthood. When the devotee becomes an Olarisha, that is one who owns or possesses an Orisha. Sorry guys, I'm having a little technical difficulties. All right, sorry about that. So Oshun was one of the most popular Orisha. So Oshun, Orisha of many titles, moods, and function. Oshun is the source, is known as the source, is the nurturing mother, feminine and seductress, beautiful enchantress, fierce protectress, powerful leader, wise counselor, and a diviner, giver of life and fertility, healing, and finally, the mother of the African fresh waters, to name just some of the more important of her numerous features and roles and manifestations. So Oshun is the rhythm mother and fertility icon. As the patroness of the fresh river waters from which she is born, Oshun embodies the cooling ashe of the water itself, providing her people with good health and vitality. As the source of all the water, she is the yielding force that is akin to the yin principle in Chinese Taoism. For those of you that know about Taoism, you know water is fluid and it just flows throughout all of life. And it's one of those things that's just really essential to life. Oshun is also the mother of prosperity and abundance, and the patroness of craftswomen, female traders, and entrepreneurs. She bestows economic success on her female devotees. She is also known as the supreme enchantress, the goddess of love and beauty. Oshun is viewed as the consort of various male deities in the Yoruba pantheon, but none are able to hold her for any length of time. Her desires are too refined and her love too overflowing to be confined by the conventions of marriage, which you can see is a stark difference from Isis and between Isis and Anna. So gender and power as expressed in the worship of Oshun. In the traditional African thought, female empowerment originates from the supreme source, such as the male authority does. Like their male counterparts, Yoruba women are believed to be born with an ashe, the divine vital force that permeates creation, including what we may refer to as personal power. We may note that the manifestation of an ashe as a personal power is not viewed in terms of gender by the Yoruba, rather than through gender-specific lens. It is perceived as human power. Female power is considered to be intrinsic, authentic, and autonomous in its essence, which is, and it was just like it's stark contrast to certain religions. Just gonna say that there. As custodians of the earth, the fire, the water, and the wood, women are, from a metaphysical perspective, agents of change, gifted with the ability to transform natural elements into tools of substance. So, and then we're going to talk about here the development of the Santeria. When the Yoruba were enslaved in great numbers and shipped to plantations in Cuba and Brazil, in the early 19th century, they brought their African religion with them. The Yoruba slaves called their African deities santos, saints, and they found ways of venerating them in Christian traditions, which we actually talked about here, but we also talked about in the study of the Virgin Mary, which actually we're going to go into next. So if you have any questions or comments before we move on, you can either type exclamation point in chat or raise your hand in Zoom. Penny or Brian, do you guys have anything?
No, I think the only thing that point out is a lot of like Oshun is, well, the other Isis and Inanna are no longer worshipped. Oshun and is still, I think, an aspect of the religious practice of the Yoruba tribes and different aspects of the divination and things like that that they had. It's still part of the contemporary society.
Thank you, Penny. Up next, I have Ron. Ron, I think you're still on mute.
I was just saying that that they had to sort of codify all these ideas because otherwise things would change dramatically overnight. Somebody could come in and say, oh, that's not the way the story goes. It goes like this. They had to find some way of codifying it to make sure that everybody believed the same thing and that these hierarchies were formed as the keepers of the story, the keepers of the narrative. If anybody veered away from the narrative and told it unlike it was traditionally told, there would be a mistake that would be corrected. Like I can't, we are locked into the Bible. Our Bible is the sort of narrative by which we define ourselves. You can't make up a story. You can't say Jesus had a son and Jesus had a daughter. You can't just keep making up stories. You can, but it's not going to have any grounds. So it seems like basically these priesthoods were established to be guardians of the narrative.
I think that's a good point. I think that's something that is definitely worthy of exploration. I would tend to agree with you on that. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? Just give it a few more seconds.
Well, I'll just say when I first encountered Oshun, I was amazed at the similarities between Sumerian, Egyptian, also Indic or Hindu insights. It's such an amazing tradition. And it grew up a little bit later than some of these others, more after, in the Common Era, not BC. So there's a lot more that could be known about it. It's not just archaeology, as Penny said. So I think it's really, really a powerful tradition.
I agree. Thank you, Brian. So now we're going to go into the Virgin Mary. So Isabella Price names this the return of the goddess, ? And we're going to see why. So her most common role is the mother of Jesus. It's the origin of her story. But there's not much, she's not talked about much in the New Testament. We know what we know from the New Testament is that she's a human woman who found favor with God. One of the most notable things is that the wedding at Cana is where she partners with Jesus in the mysterious unfolding of his divinity. To note, there's nothing about Mary's birth in the Bible. Very little about her and her relationship with Joseph. And we know that she was present at the cross when Jesus died.
Mm-hmm.
So so some of the things that we do know about Mary did not actually come from canonical scriptures. It came from biographical scriptures. And what those are, just really quickly, is a summary of this, is that these are collection of Jewish religious works written between 300 BCE to 300 CE. Basically, these are stories that didn't make it, I always say that just didn't make it into the Bible, but they're still stories about Jewish and Christian faith. So that's where we hear more about Mary. So where do we hear about Mary? In the Pro-Evangelium of James, it's attributed to Jesus's brother. And one thing that I did forget to say is that pseudographical scriptures are named to authors that we know did not write the scriptures, but they are attributed to them. So this was attributed to James, but we know that James did not write it, which was Jesus's brother. We know that Mary's parents, from the scripture, we know that Mary's parents are Joachim and Anna. They were rich and pious, but childless. Similar to Mary, Anna received an angelic revelation that she has conceived a child, just like Mary did about Jesus. The parents then vowed to commit the child to the life of service. And Mary is dedicated as a perpetual virgin. And there's some, and it also says in the scripture that Mary's body could not corrode. So now we're going to talk about the virgin birth. The New Testament has infancy narratives. So in Luke 1, verses 26 to 38, Mary is an active agent in the story, because she has to respond and accept the invitation. God doesn't force this on her. She has to accept it freely. Catholicism celebrates this as the Feast of the Annunciation. There's a question about Mary's remaining a virgin after Jesus's birth. You know, in the New Testament, it is mentioned that Jesus had other brothers and sisters, which, you know, some would lead to the version that Mary was not a virgin after Jesus was born. I mean, Mary did not remain a virgin. And some Christians in the early Christian movement wanted to keep Mary a virgin because it was considered to be the purest state. So then we're going to talk about Mary as the God-bearer. Mary was declared God-bearer at the Council of Ephesus in 43 CE. Ephesus was where the great temple dedicated to the Greek goddess Artemis stood until the cult of Artemis was prohibited by the Christian emperor Theodosius. And Mary was seen as the replacement to the goddess Artemis. And, you know, this is where some of Mary's quote unquote power or divine aspects, I would say, probably came from. Just as we talked about Oshun's, and also we see, as you know, the myth of Mary traveled, other religions that were forced to go into hiding, or they were forced to adapt to Christianity, put some of those qualities of their goddesses onto Mary too. So just an interesting note. And then now we're going to talk about the Assumption of Mary. In 1950, the doctrine of the Assumption officially was proclaimed by Pope Pius XIII. The Assumption is the doctrine that Mary was taken up body and soul into heaven. There were texts known as Mary's Dormition. This text states that after the death of Jesus, Mary was visited by an angel. The angel assured her that she would be reunited with her son. So in this text, when Mary died and her body was placed in the tomb, Jesus appeared in a cloud surrounded by angels, and her soul ascended into heaven. And then we're going to talk about Mary, Queen of Heaven. Like I said, this is very similar to Isis. Wait, was it Isis or Inanna? I can't remember. Inanna, sorry. She was proclaimed this in 1954. She was associated with military interventions, which is something I didn't know before I read the book. and similar to Inanna and Athena. Inanna was known as the queen of practical knowledge civilization. As you can see, there's some integration between Inanna and Mary here. Mary had protective powers. The figure of Mary is associated with a crown of stars similar to Inanna, and she's the patroness of ships and sailors. Fertility and childbirth similar to the other goddesses we have studied, notably Oshun and Isis. So as you can see, other qualities of these other goddesses got wrapped into Mary because it was more acceptable. And then we're going to talk about the Black Virgin. She was found in Spain, France, Poland, Italy, Switzerland, and Germany. The Black Virgin was a pre-Christian goddess. We're rededicated to the Black Virgin to allow people to continue their devotion to the archetypal image. And she was an embodiment of all of the elemental forces of nature. And her darkness was seen as the beginning. And when we think about the beginning, we always think about things new. I always think of like a new creation, right? Or even like a restart, a new beginning, right? So does anybody, I know I went through that kind of quick because I just wanted to keep focused on the time, but does anybody have any questions or comments? Brian and Penny, do you want to add anything too?
Well, I think as Ron has pointed out, with the Jewish tradition of a single male God, the Christians have felt, I don't know, a need to supplement or complement with the Mother Mary, and you've laid out nicely how that evolved.
Yeah, and I think too, you know, like I said, it's just very interesting to see how many different aspects of goddesses got wrapped into Mary. And I just think she was a safe figure, like the Virgin Mary. I know some people don't like the emphasis on Mary, but you know, just knowing all the different aspects, I just think it's beautiful. So if anybody has any questions or comments, you can type exclamation point in the chat or raise your hand in Zoom. I will give it another 30 seconds.
I would just say one thing, I do see where that Mary is kind of has a lot of the characteristics of the other goddesses, but the church as an entity was very much wanting to keep the patriarchal, male-dominated society in place, and really was not upgrading women and giving them any kind of a equal position.
Yeah, I think especially, I would agree with that. And I think that's why I do agree. And I think, you know, in this aspect, I think that's why a lot of women did relate to, not only relate to Mary, but they could wrap themselves, like they're, like you said, or, you know, like we talk about, because of slavery and, you know, Christian becoming the dominant religion, people had to figure out different ways. So to still keep their worship, but at the same time, you know, because if not, they could die, you know, they could be drowned, they could be burned at the stake, you know, all these things, different things can happen to them. So
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Penny.
Well, one of the things I just thought was interesting was one of the origins of the feminine movement in the United States was that women were against slavery. They thought that that institution was wrong, and they were trying to get it changed. And there was a big meeting in England on the topic of slavery. And so a group of women in the States who had been a political force trying to get slavery changed went over to England And actually the church wrote to the people in England and said, these women are coming, you know, and, you know, you shouldn't let them basically participate. And so when they arrived and they got this message to England before the women arrived, when they got there, then the women were told that they could participate in the meeting, but they were not allowed to speak. They could only sit there and watch. And they were so enraged that, you know, they were not allowed to express their opinions. Because of course, at the time, you know, women couldn't vote. I mean, anything in the States, then that really started the beginning of the feminist movement in this country, was because these women were not allowed to try to express their opinions about slavery.
You know what's so funny about that? And I'm just going to say this because I know Ron wants to go. But I just think of it, and the history, my history teacher actually told this story about the author of this book, and I can't remember I can remember the author, but I can't remember the name of the book. I want to say, I know it's Harriet Beecher Stowe, but I can't remember the name of the book. But he said the story, and he said Abraham Lincoln, like, he gave this grand presentation, which we were all enthralled with. And he looked at Harriet Beecher Stowe, and he said, so you're the woman that caused the Civil War. I can't remember the name of the book. I want to say it was Uncle Tom's Cabin, but I think that's wrong. But
No, I think that is her book.
It is. I might be right. I don't know, but I don't want to be like, I'm not 100% sure, so I don't want to say, yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I think that's very interesting that, and thank you for bringing that up. Up next, I have Ron.
Yeah, one of the things that puzzles me is the insistence that Mary remain a virgin. That we argue, or the church argues, that Mary's virginity is a very important part of who she is. It defies logic that a woman could give birth to and then be considered a virgin. I mean, it's. I guess God planted the seed inside her without having sex with her, without going through her vagina. Is that the whole process? I mean, sort of like just planted a seed in her. Biologically speaking, how did that happen?
I think that part of it is that it wasn't biological. It was a whole spiritual thing.
I see. So there was no need for sex. Yeah.
Yeah.
But the Greeks also had a goddess. The Greeks had Artemis, who was a virgin goddess.
Yeah, there was quite a few, and I didn't go through it in this too much because, like I said, this is a summation. But in the original presentation, it says, but virgin goddess in Greek culture meant a very different thing, that they had the ability to choose if they wanted to take a lover or not take a lover. And Artemis, and there was another goddess that they could actively choose not to, and they could actively choose to, and that's powerful. And the reasons why were up to them. It was just total freedom, and it was like more of an independent, like, I don't need a lover, I'm powerful on my own type of vibe to it. But yeah, it has a different, you're right, it does. In the Greek goddess, there were several virgin goddesses, but the main difference is it wasn't seen like as to be pure, as in Mary, right? In that Mary tradition, it wasn't seen, you didn't do it to be pure, you did it because that's what you wanted to do. So now we're gonna go to this is the last one, which is actually ironic because it was the beginning of the series, kind of, sort of. And when I say the beginning, this is what sparked it. I wanted to study Mary Magdalene. I had never did a presentation with 52 Living Ideas. Cherie Kant let me use his platform to do that. And so out of this came the Divine Feminine series. And that's when I partnered with Brian and Penny to do the series. So starting from beginning, we're ending with the beginning. How ironic. So Mary Magdalene. So why do we study Mary Magdalene? She is one of the most talked about females in the Bible, which is kind of ironic because she's not mentioned that much in the Bible. But she has so many stories attached to her. Like I said before, she's mentioned very little in the New Testament, but she's seen as one of the most important figures in starting the Christian movement because she told people about Jesus. So in Luke 8:1-3, it says, after this, Jesus traveled from one town and village to another, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, and also some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases. Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out. Joanna, the wife of Chuza, the manager of Harold's household, Susanna, and many others. These women were helping to support them out of their own means. So we know from that passage that Mary was a woman of wealth, that she was single, that she had enough money to support herself and Jesus's ministry. The question is, where did her wealth come from? So in those days, either it was inherited or it was from business. Either way, she was a good steward of her money, and she had to be in order to be able to support the ministry. So either way, she was a woman of wealth, ironically independent, right? So in Matthew 27:57-61, so basically, as this is where Mary is at the tomb of Jesus. And as evening approached, came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph. He went to Pilate and got Jesus's body, and it was given to him. And he took the body, wrapped it in a clean cloth, and placed it in his own tomb. And Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting at opposite of the tomb. And why is this significant? Because Mary was with Jesus's mother. The burial at that time was a very intimate ceremony. Jesus would have been completely naked at the burial at the tomb. And it shows the intimacy that Mary had with Jesus, that Jesus was there. So her importance had to be a lot. And this is still in the Bible. And it was noted in the Bible that about the importance of Mary Magdalene. So you can see she is an important figure. And she was also at the cross. And so the significance of that is, at a Roman crucifixion, you weren't allowed to be at the cross. If you were at the cross with the people being crucified, you could be put on the cross yourself. So her and Mary were taking a huge risk to their lives and to die a painful death. If they were, if the Roman soldiers wanted to, they could put them up on the cross as well. The only person that we know was at the cross from his disciples or from the 12 apostles was John. And then in Luke 24:10, it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary, the mother of James, and others that told the apostles that he had risen from the dead. But they said that they didn't listen to them because it seemed like nonsense, which was ironic because he kind of told them this was going to happen. But they were the first people to see that Jesus had risen from the dead, and they were the first people to announce it. So Mary becomes the apostle to the apostles in that act. Jesus reveals himself to Mary, and like I said before, she's the first to announce the resurrection of Jesus, and then she disappears after that from the canonical scriptures. You don't hear about her again. But she is heard about in the Gospel of Mary, which is a Gnostic gospel, which we're going to talk about. So in the Gospel of Mary, like I said, it's part of the Gnostic Gospels. It was found at Nag Hammadi. It's the only gospel attributed to a woman, which I just thought was very interesting. Obviously, we know it was not written by Mary Magdalene, but these are a collection of stories of word of mouth about people's interactions with Mary. So why is this so important? It shows what happened after the resurrection of Jesus. It shows Mary as being an important figure in the early church and spreading the gospel, and that many disciples come to know Jesus through Mary's testimony. So that's just that's just very powerful. So what does this gospel say? So first of all, let's just start that it's only 8 pages because some of the pages are missing. Through destruction, through burning, various things, but they could only recover 8. So there are parts that are missing. But basically it says that Jesus gave Mary special teachings. That Mary encouraged the male disciples to go on and preach the gospel, even though they were scared, because you could still get persecuted and die for preaching the gospel. But one of the things, so some of the things that were taught, that spirituality comes from the mind. Sin does not exist. And then there's this story about Peter asking Mary what Christ said to her. And then in chapter 8, it talks about the various stages that the soul goes through. And in the first presentation, I think we've actually read the Gospel of Mary, because like I said, it was only 8 pages. So we've read through those 8 pages. And it talks about the various stages that the soul goes through. Some of the reasons it was discredited, obviously there's some pages missing, but it went against the traditional teachings of the church and the patriarchy, because that means a woman had a very powerful role. And it was written well after Mary's death. So that's some of the reasons why people don't believe it. So now we're just going to go into some misconceptions about Mary. Obviously, I think the most popular one is that she was a prostitute. She was mistaken as the woman with the bad reputation washing Jesus's feet with her hair. Pope Gregory said that woman was Mary Magdalene. And they say it was to discredit Mary because she was becoming a powerful figure in the church. But she was also that symbol of ultimate repentance, right? But it was a good story too. Prostitution comes to Jesus, she's repents, but still a good story. And a lot of Christians related because of that imperfection, sexual sin and all that. Another rumor was Mary was married to Jesus. Think of the Da Vinci Code, but how it originated is that Jesus was seen kissing Mary in the Gospel of Philip, and that Mary had a very intimate relationship with Jesus. And we see that again with her being at the burial at the tomb. That was like, and usually, and you got to understand one more thing is that women and men don't have that close of a relationship in these times. Like, there's no like male or female friendships. It's marriage, right? So that's another reason too. And so, thank you guys for listening. This is the end of my presentation. Like I said, this is abbreviated of all the presentations that we gave. Does anybody have any questions or comments before we wrap up?
Well, I would just like to say thank you very much for putting this together. Also, this is not the end of the series. The Penny's going to present next month on the Minoan goddesses. So I just wanted to get that in before the last minute.
Oh, no problem. And also, later on, we're going to do Cowley from this book too, but I want to collaborate with some people on that because I really don't have much knowledge of it. So I really want to do a good job and be respectful of it as well.
I think Paul
Um,
has some.
Yep. Paul, you can go right ahead.
Yeah, just a question. Thanks for the wonderful presentation. In this last one, it occurs to me that the figures in the New Testament, in the Bible, there's some reason at least that isn't too off base to think there's historical figures, like Jesus existed, Mary existed, as in historical figures. Like there's a reference in another Roman historian's document about Jesus and things like that. So if we take it for a moment that there's at least some evidence that these are historical figures, does that make this version of the goddess unique in all the goddess stories? That's my question. That's my question.
I would say yes. That does make it unique in that these were historical figures. I think one of the things is about the Bible is like it's that aspect of human and divine, and there's certain archaeological evidence that these places existed in the Bible, and in the Bible where they talk about the crucifixion, you can read accounts of Roman crucifixions and other historical accounts. So we know that this type of practice for executing criminals did happen. There are some records that there was a man named Jesus that was crucified. Now, whether or not he had divine powers, strictly historical aspects would say, I don't know. But they also has been historical accounts of finding the tomb of Jesus, or where people say the tomb of Jesus is, that place exists. So I think you're right. I think that's what makes it unique. But then there's also aspects, like I said before, of other goddesses wrapped into Mary, the mother of Jesus. And I think as to Mary Magdalene, yeah, I mean, we know she existed. Whether it's the Bible is the exact account of it, I'm not sure. I tend to think of the Gospel of Mary as an historical account based on oral tradition. Like you said, there's pages missing. It was written well after Mary, but there's a lot of stories that are written well after they happened because they were passed down through word of mouth. And to be honest, I don't think they would have written much down because of fear of being persecuted. So I think these are probably passed down, oral tradition wise.
Thanks.
Yeah, I hope that answered your question. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? So hearing none, I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight on this journey. This will be a continuing series, but I just wanted to really just kind of recap everything that we've learned thus far. I know certain people are new to this, and again, this was just a summary. So thank you and have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ebony.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Bye.
Ebony.
Bye.